This lecture covers the late 19th century and the first major modern art movement, Realism, along with photography and the rise of modernism. Now, the late 19th century will witness the full effects and feel the full effects of the Industrial Revolution, whereby, just to show you a map here of the industrialization of Europe, we now have cities of over 1 million people in London and Paris, and of course populations exploding elsewhere. The railroads are going to connect these vast distances, such as between Glasgow and London, or Paris with Amsterdam, allowing people greater freedom and more mobility. The same can be said for the United States, where we find New York also has a population of 1 million people at this time, and railways are going to be connecting it down through Philadelphia and DC. Modernity as we know it coincides with the modern art movements known as modernism. So by the 1830s, the Industrial Revolution, these technologies are going to be fully felt throughout the Western European and American world. You find that the demand for coal and iron is going to skyrocket at this time because they fuel everything that is going to make modernity modern. So we have improved mining and metallurgy techniques and improved transportation to move these massive amounts of thousands of tons of raw material of coal and iron coming from areas that are the colonies of these major European nations. Thus the locomotive and the steamship will lead to the growth of cities and population migration from rural areas to urban areas because that is where the jobs are located, and then, like today, people will always go where the jobs are. Now, the Enlightenment, as we have discussed, connected this movement that began in the late 17th century, connected this notion that if we put our faith in science, then we will progress as a civilization, as a species, that things will get better. And so, in many ways, it did. We had new objects, cheaper merchandise. We can move more rapidly. We can afford more things. We can go more places. However, the lack of control and restraint placed upon these industrialists that own these factories led to the exploitation of the working class and is going to sow the seeds of revolution in 1848 we will discuss today. It was in that year that Karl Marx wrote his very famous Communist Manifesto. The German author is going to believe that the working class, the proletariat, is being exploited by the class that owns the means of production. So he advocated the seizure of power by the working class, a system, a political system that will eventually lead to and be adopted by the Russians known as communism. Now, this is going to be at the same time we find the rise of imperialism, where every major European industrial and American power will need the raw materials for industrialization. Therefore, they had to exploit areas in Africa and Asia which were rich with these materials. So we find that they were all divided up between England, France, Spain, Germany, America, Austria, and so forth. You find that geologists at this time, while we're expanding, are now going to discover that the world is actually older than 6,000 years, which was, of course, going to be backed up by Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, that also will state that life evolves through natural selection. So, first off, we find that scientists are going to be questioning the veracity of religious texts such as the Bible that claims the earth is only 6,000 years old, which leads to an entire scientific revolution and upheaval again in the 19th century when we begin to suggest what evolution might mean for our species. And then finally, the social dimension is that if in fact people can believe that species evolve, and that, as Darwin states, you find that it's survival of the fittest, that being the ones that are the most appropriately tasked to survive in their given environment. Therefore, Anglo-Saxon upper-class individuals, the Caucasians of the Western world, believe that they were put there through social Darwinism because they were the most equipped to succeed, the fittest. So we have this pseudo-scientific argument that the Caucasian Western nations of Europe have the right to subdue and to control Africa and Asia because they are not as advanced, they are not industrialized. Now, it was at this time where we have these explosions in technology and with the materials to make it happen and to actually support it, that the scientific inventions we're all familiar with were actually created. Not in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. Everything that led to these major innovations that we know today. The telegraph was invented and helped the Union win the Civil War, for instance. We could communicate across vast distances immediately. The telephone is invented in the 19th century. And of course, fun fact, Thomas Edison suggested that we shouldn't say hello, but ahoy. Then you have the radio. So now we can actually send radio signals and sound waves across vast distances. Electricity begins to power whole cities. We have light at night. We can, of course, work past the sundown. Then steel, explosives, and finally photography. Photography being one of the most important inventions for our purposes because it completely changes the role of art and what it means. Now, photography is preceded by a type of projection of space with an aperture and light through it by nearly 300 years. So you find that Leonardo da Vinci is going to describe this device that he uses called a camera obscura, which was actually also known in antiquity, which is where you will block off all of the light sources to a given small room. You then open a hole the size of, depending upon what type of focus you want, either a dime or a nickel, and that the objects on the outside of the room will appear upside down because light travels in a straight line just as it does coming into our eyes and hitting our retinas. So that being the top of a tree or the sky would wind up on the bottom of the wall, whereas the earth or the trunk of a tree would wind up on the top of the wall. So here is an actual photograph of a camera obscura in Italy and Umbria looking at their countryside. So artists had access to this technology and could use it to trace basic compositions and how, once again, the world would appear on a flat surface. The downside, of course, is that these rooms are not mobile by any stretch of the imagination, and the image that's going to form is very faint and weak and lacking lush colors and crisp detail. So we find that with this upside-down painted world, we need to move ahead and innovate. And that happens in the 17th century when the Dutch come up with what we would consider to be a portable tracing table. So the box camera obscura is going to have a lens on the front of it that can be focused with a mirror that would invert the image naturally projected upside down onto a piece of glass where you could trace it. So we could point it at any number of subjects. We've already discussed this with Vermeer because it was believed he used some version of a camera obscura, whether it be this box version or not. He then is able to capture almost photorealistically what a three-dimensional room would look like on a two-dimensional surface. However, what the camera obscura and the box version both lack is the ability to fix this image permanently. Along comes Louis-Jacques de Gogh with the solution to this issue when he invents photography in Paris in 1839. Now they come up with the term photography, or photos meaning light and graphos meaning writing. So literally they needed to come up with a way to explain what is happening to the general public and to other scientists. So they called it writing with light. The first variety that is very famous with photography is a daguerreotype. Daguerreotypes, such as seen here, are going to be copper plates polished with silver and coated with silver halide particles that affix to this photoreactive chemical, right, deposited by iodine vapor. Now, this means that the longer a plate is exposed to light, the darker it burns an image into it. The downside to this process is, of course, you get a single positive impression, right? You cannot make copies of this type of photography. But it still does allow something that was never possible in the history of art, and that is to accurately and objectively record what things look like, albeit through black and white means. Now, the first examples that we have of photography, while they're trying to discover what this new medium possibly could be and do, can be seen here in Degas' Still Life in Studio, whereby they recreate the same subjects people would be familiar with in the salon and for fine art. Obviously, they had to choose stationary, inanimate objects at the beginning because exposure times took between 15 and 30 minutes. Thus, you do not have a very crisp set of details here, right? It's going to find it blurring even if we have a north and south facing window that minimizes the shifting of shade over the course of an hour. Now, how it is presented to people is interesting because you find that people do not really know what this new technology is and what to think about it. So Degas shows them that it can do what previously painting had done. So we use genres people are familiar with, right? They're comfortable with. They know what a still life is, a gathering of objects together. They know what portraits are. They know what landscapes are. These are all genres for traditional fine art and especially painting. So from the beginning, Degas sets up photography as an alternative to painting and doing what painting cannot, and that is objectively record the world. Now, this objectivity, which of course leads to the statement that a photograph never lies, is actually untrue. Turning to the second use for photography after its initial experimentation by Degas and others, you're going to have it used for photojournalistic purposes, such as in the Civil War. Here we have Timothy O'Sullivan, a famous Civil War photographer, using an albumen print to photograph the home of the rebel sharpshooter at the battlefield at Gettysburg in 1863. So in it, seemingly, we have an image of a Southern Confederate soldier who was picking off or shooting as a sharpshooter Union men at a distance behind this wall. So this is documentary photography, which is going to be very commonly used even to this day to show people what is happening in the world. However, the fact that people believe they're looking at something entirely truthful is deceptive even in the 19th century. So we have the ability to record objectively, but this is staged. So just like Benjamin West in his modern history painting, whereby the general did not die heroically surrounded by individuals that are going to, in a Christ-like fashion, lament his passing, even the quote-unquote noble savage looking on. Instead, as with O'Sullivan, we find the body is going to be dragged to this location. And in fact, that wasn't even his gun that we're accusing him of being a sniper. That's actually O'Sullivan, the photographer's own gun that he staged to make it look like this man was picking off Union soldiers from a distance. So you find from the outset, photography, it can be manipulated even though it seems that it's objective. Now, the question then becomes, is photography a documentary tool or art? Is it something that primarily should be used just to document the appearance of things and/or events? Or, as Gogh presented it to start out with, and certainly as Nadar, the most famous photographer of the late 19th century, photographing all of the most famous personalities in Paris, would say that it's an art just like painting. In fact, in the 19th century, when texts are going to be written on the way in which to discuss photography, they use terms that are drawn from painting. Now here we have artists who are going to react strongly against including photography in the canon of fine art. Right, here you have Honoré Daumier, the great critic and wonderful satirist in the 19th century, showing that Nadar is up here in his hot air balloon trying to elevate photography to the heights of art, mocking, of course, the number of photography studios and shops that have opened up where anyone can go in, buy a camera, and with a training in an afternoon call themselves an artist. Right? So you find that photography has come a long way in its acceptance in the fine art world, but there is still a distinction that is generally considered to be the case among art critics and historians, and that is, photography is a tool if it's primarily used to document an event or the appearance of something. So for scientific purposes, or in the case of the famous photograph of the sailor returning from World War II, showing the exuberance felt by Americans as the war has ended, that is documenting what has happened, right? Not meant to be interpreted in artistic fashion. Whereas art photography, such as that by Alfred Stieglitz photographing Georgia O'Keeffe here on the left, is not primarily designed to record someone's appearance or an event. In fact, she is fairly anonymous. The artfulness of the photograph in this instance is going to come from the beautiful composition and the obscurity of it. We do not have the artist here shown fully frontally, nor recording, for instance, her appearance. Now, regardless of whether or not you believe all photography is art, it doesn't really change the fact that photography forever alters the direction of the fine arts, because now the fine arts are no longer required to mimetically record what the outside world looks like objectively. And so we have this freeing of the fine arts that eventually leads to complete abstraction. Because if you want something photorealistically rendered, then just take a photograph of it now. Now, turning to an artist who's going to begin this movement away from something that is entirely photographic, while still ironically founding the first major modern art movement called Realism, Gustave Courbet is going to show us that modernism is going to come out of this uncertainty, this feeling of uncertainty and industrialization, where there's a lack of fixity, and that our experience of the world is fleeting. Everything is changing on a daily basis. Nothing will be the same. So therefore, in the first modern art movement, which he entitles Realism, he states that you can only show that which can be seen as real. Therefore, famously, he stated, when people asked why he didn't paint religious scenes, he states, "If you show me an angel, I'll paint one." So you find that his works are rejected repeatedly from the official French salon, the academic arm of the state that shows what official art is. And so he sets up his own pavilion of realism, illustrating these scenes that make the bourgeoisie, the wealthy merchant class, very uncomfortable. Right? So just to clearly understand what he's suggesting, realism can only show that which can currently be seen at the time it was painted. So therefore, realism cannot even include historical scenes, because we cannot see these individuals that are deceased. Now, turning to his Stonebreakers, we have an excellent introduction to what realism is going to stand for. Painted in 1849 and unfortunately destroyed in World War II in 1945, this painting depicts two individuals at the beginning and ends of their life, the extremely poor, right, shown as poor in a very unidealized and non-allegorical way. So this is going to take place and be painted directly after the workers' revolt against the Second Republic in France. In 1848, a number of revolutions are going to spring up throughout Europe, right? And once again, in these major cities, in response to Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, the proletariat or the poor demand better working conditions. They demand regulations. So this image would make a wealthy middle-class individual very uncomfortable because it reminds them of the volatility of their political system. Now, what makes this so unique and different from what came before it is unabashedly realistic. So we find that the terms realism can be clearly differentiated from naturalism in that the most appreciated academic French painter, which American collectors also adored, Alphonse William Bouguereau, is going to paint images that are incredibly naturalistic. He is an excellent technician, and with oil painting is able to render and capture the effects of light coming through trees, the different textures, carefully observe nude models, all of which are very naturalistic and appear as though they would in reality. But this is not realism because, of course, one cannot see mythological figures like satyrs in reality. So you find that Gustave Courbet focuses only on that which can be seen. In a very stark monochromatic color choice, we find that the figures are going to be shown in a very straightforward fashion and anonymously. They could be anyone in the working poor, breaking rocks on the side of a road, which is the most unskilled labor that anyone can get, which is breaking larger rocks into smaller rocks, much as you might find people picking up trash on the side of the highway today. Not a very skilled activity. So you find that the young boy is going to have patched clothes, his shirt falling to tatters, and he actually is going to have suspenders holding up his oversized pants. The older man's vest jacket is tearing. Their poor meal can be seen off in the background to the right on this kettle, showing what they can afford to eat. All of which are very straightforward and unidealized, unembellished. So here, like Theodore Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, we have a contemporary event that, of course, could be seen, but it is entirely insignificant, right? So the Raft of the Medusa, no, these individuals are not wealthy, but it sparked a firestorm politically in France, and it was a very significant political event. So now we have these monumental figures with Courbet that lack any type of grand narrative. They're not going about being rescued. They're not surviving any great ordeal. They're just living their daily lives as the poor. And there is no moral value that can be added to it beyond this. It just is what it is, that being poor individuals working. Now, in glorifying the mundane, this becomes the hallmark of the modern moving forward with movements that come after realism like Impressionism. Turning to Edward Manet, we have an artist that works around the same time as Courbet and practices a realist phase in the 1860s. He is very well trained and has won several awards by the time he starts painting in a new way. He wins awards from the official French Salon and is recognized as one of the great academic artists of his day. He will then exhibit with the Impressionists as well in the 1870s, but he becomes known as the father of modernism, for he moves even further beyond past art to create a style that is distinctly modern by turning academic training on its head, by once again looking at what has been done before and then revealing the criteria underneath it, the assumptions that we take for granted with academic art. One of the best examples of that is his Olympia from 1863, a life-size, reclining or recumbent nude portrait of a woman with a black maidservant at the foot of her bed holding flowers, while a cat, a black cat in the lower right-hand corner, is on its haunches hissing at us. The image is going to become known as the first modern nude, for it shows a woman exactly as she is, instead of in the guise of a famous character from history, the Bible, or mythology. Now, this is lampooning the Venus of Urbino, the most famous reclining female nude from the Renaissance painted by the Venetian master Titian. Now, she is in the same pose, reclining on the bed, tilting her body towards the viewer, with her right elbow brought up and her left hand on her pelvis. You find that we also have a servant behind her, in this case holding flowers, instead of the two grabbing her clothes. And then finally, the dog that is asleep at the base of Venus's feet has been switched out for a cat. Thus, of course, we are making it very obvious what this is a painting of, and that is a prostitute, because it is a play on the word cat house. Olympia as well, entitling this work Olympia, would have signaled to Manet's viewers expressly that this is in fact a prostitute, because that is a very popular name of a low-class street-walking prostitute at the time. Now, we noted earlier that in the Venus of Urbino, she too is technically a prostitute, but we do not show her as such. She is going to be in the guise of a goddess. Therefore, we are removing this veil. Now, all of these subtle changes by Manet infuriated critics because it reveals the very carefully constructed world of the academic nude, which is there for male delectation and the viewer. You find that we can't even understand or believe that the Olympia is nude because she's actually still wearing fashionable mule heel slippers, right? She has a choker right around her neck. She's wearing earrings, right, in this way. Now, this is universally criticized by art critics and journals, and they mock it mercilessly. They're very uncomfortable with this painting because it is the first time that a woman has actually defied the male gaze. That being, she is criticized for being unfinished, and certainly Manet did not distinguish the tonality between, say, her thigh, abdomen, breast, and arm here. So they criticize her as being made of Indian rubber or wearing a gorilla suit, having a sickly toad right over her pelvis. Now, the difference between the two and how they are presented may not immediately be recognizable to a modern audience, but if you carefully look at how encoded the Venus of Urbino is for male viewers, whereby she coyly tilts her head to the side, passively seducing us, while at the same time masturbating, inviting the view of the male, inviting the male to participate. Whereas in Manet's Olympia, we have a real prostitute who is clamping down over her pelvis, who's going to be sitting up and staring aggressively at us, not coyly inviting us to look upon her, but instead she is looking back aggressively. So we have here the difference between a real prostitute and one in the guise of an ancient Roman or Greek goddess. Now, this rejects the male gaze, thus calling attention to the fact that these images were made to objectify women. So this is once again one of the first examples we find in the history of art of feminine agency, of a woman controlling how she is being seen, and is of course not going to be coyly inviting us to objectify her. Now, turning to Thomas Eakins, we're going to have the American version of realism with an artist who studies painting and anatomy in Philadelphia and teaches and is a professor for perspective. Now, he trains under the very classical, neoclassical artist Jerome, who falls in line with that of David and Ingres, and will use photographic studies in his works to make the figures appear as naturalistic and realistic as possible. In his Gross Clinic, we have from 1875 a work that was originally rejected due to the brutal realism. Now, it was commissioned originally for the Philadelphia exhibition of the American Independence Centennial, but obviously it went too far for audiences, whereby we see Dr. Gross here operating in the amphitheater of Jefferson Medical College, and this painting is actually going to be bought and hung there until it was recently sold for $68 million. The lecture that Dr. Samuel Gross is performing here after he has cut open the leg, the thigh of this boy to lecture on osteomyelitis, a bone infection that the boy is suffering from, we find that in a very prosaic the presentation of the scene is incredibly straightforward, which took many people aback. In the foreground, we actually have the assistants to Dr. Samuel Gross, who are going to be spreading open the wound that he has made in this incision in order to investigate the femur. Behind them, we find a man is going to be holding a white cloth over, once again, the boy's face. We see very, in an unappealing and straightforward fashion, his buttocks on the operating table while he still wears socks. The mother to the boy cringes in the back left, turning away from, the horrific scene. The subject is painted several times by Eakins, but never with such ferocity and straightforward, brutal realism. In the work, we find that we have a lecture hall at a medical college, where we have another one here at Agnew Clinic, where you find that the students would sit in a circular pattern around a central operating table. The main surgeon would then lecture on what was happening at the time. Now, if we look at a detail of Dr. Gross himself, we note that the precision is not necessarily the primary focus of Eakins. Instead, the brutal realism comes through by way of the nonchalant way he lectures, while holding in his hand a bloody scalpel that is very brightly illuminated, much like the dramatic lighting coming off of his head and highlighting him in the background. Now, we know in the background here a new invention is being illustrated, and this would of course be of interest to medical students because anesthetics are introduced into surgery in 1846. So instead of just biting on a leather thong and then drinking bourbon, we can actually, through the application of having them inhale ether, put a subject under. Of course, this was very dangerous just like today, so anesthesiologists still must be very careful not to overdose individuals. Here, with this detail, you can see them prodding through this wound, which of course the grotesque nature of it, notably they're not wearing gloves, nor are they wearing white lab coats. They're in street attire, which was common in the 19th century. And so the mother is notably horrified and looks away. Now, this is seemingly the same subject as Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp, where you have a prelector of an anatomy guild lecturing on a dissected corpse in front of him. However, the difference is Rembrandt's is a pretext for showing a group portrait. Eakins, however, is just recording the event, not showcasing who these individuals were, many of them being left in shadow or undefined entirely. right? So this is a real doctor performing a real operation with real reactions. So it's not a pretense for a different genre. We're not setting this as a stage in order to record even what Dr. Samuel Gross looks like, because he's left fairly undefined. Now, of course, we might ask, is this actually realistic? And the answer then would be no. Like all of realism, and photography for that matter, he carefully selected, of course, the amount of light in the scene, what is being highlighted, who is being seen from what angle, what vantage point is chosen. All of these are carefully selected. If you look at a photograph here of an earlier operation under ether, the same type of operation where they would put the subject under with this anesthetic, we find individuals randomly standing around, and the drama is very much lacking in what's happening. This lecture looks at the late 19th century and the two styles that are closely related of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, looking at the development that came from Realism, developing out of it, and then expanding the ideas further with a new subject, no longer restricted solely to the poor, but now for the entertainments of the bourgeoisie or the middle class. Now, modernists are going to be very interested in the perceptible phenomenon of reality and the ability to express that to a real or secular audience with real, tangible subjects. So we find that realism is going to accomplish this by showcasing the urban working poor and the rural working poor. And we find that Courbet is certainly successful in challenging the established academic salon. The Impressionists are going to take this idea and expand it with an interest in color theory and optics starting off. And of course, with the color wheel, a quick review, where Newton discovered that both ends of the spectrum of color could be combined when the red-violet wraparound to form the primary colors in the center here, yellow, red, and blue. Those colors being the ones that cannot be mixed to create with any other hue. Then finally, you have secondary colors, which are made by mixing the primary colors. Thus, you mix yellow and blue, you'll get green. You mix yellow and red, you'll get orange. All right, now across from the color wheel, we have complementary colors that, when placed next to one another, will appear to oscillate and or are very bright. So we find that the Impressionists are going to be very sensitive to color theory and realize that there is no true black in nature. Instead, we have merely the reflection of, and a darker version of, whatever color is going to be within shadows or next to them. The most popular and famous of the Impressionists is arguably Claude Monet, but he is one of many who exhibited together in the 1870s and 1880s. The very first show takes place in 1874, where the term Impressionism is coined. So just like Baroque, Impressionism is going to be a pejorative term. It's derogatory, stating, as this critic recorded in his review, that the painters had not even given them completed works for viewing with the public or critics, but instead merely impressions of paintings. So the Impressionists, of course, are going to adopt this rather negative nom de guerre, and it becomes part of the official name for the movement. Now, the subjects of the Impressionists, and there's a variety of different Impressionists working together, are generally going to be of modern life, like that of Realists, but they generally will incorporate more landscapes and the leisurely activities of the bourgeoisie. That is, what were the upper middle class doing with their time, their leisure, picnicking, going to ballets, horse races, etc. Now, Impressionism is going to take that idea established with realism even further, that modernity is in flux, that experiencing modernity means that images very often are not going to be solid and crisp and in focus, that they are going to be shifting and moving just as our fast-paced reality and our experience of it also does. Here we have the painting that very often is credited for giving Impressionism its name, the Impression Sunrise, painted in 1872 and exhibited in that first exhibition. You find that the work is signed and dated in the lower left-hand corner, as are many of them for the Impressionists, because unlike making paintings for the French Salon, where you would have the ability to go see it and you would have a pamphlet outlining who everyone was exhibiting there, the Impressionists are going to start painting in the dealer-critic system for the audience at large, that being the general public will walk in off the street to one of these galleries and buy these paintings. Therefore, signing them is very important for the notoriety of artists. Now, in Impression Sunrise, what we actually have is the reflection of the orange ball of the sun in the off-axis right, which is reflected in the same colors, mixing a kind of peach, white, and orange in the choppy waves below, whereas the sky above is illuminated. Now, the actual subject, which is painted here in complementary colors of orange and blue, right, again giving you that shimmering iridescent effect, is taken from the harbor of Le Havre, which is in Normandy, the northern coast of France, where Monet spent his youth. And we find that Monet will always gravitate towards water scenes. So at the very end of his life, most famously, he's going to be painting his water lilies. But if we look at a photograph of what he is going to be painting, you'll notice that the factories, the smokestacks, and the industrial blight that we normally would have that wouldn't be picturesque is not detailed. We find that they are going to be backlit with the sun. In the foreground, we have these figures in boats, hastily sketched out. And instead of showing the subjects as these architectural structures or people in the foreground, the subject for Monet becomes light and atmosphere, how we experience the world, which is not always crisp and detailed and in focus, but is still going to be, nevertheless, optically how we would see a very foggy or hazy sunrise or sunset. Now, the experiments that Monet will carry out illustrate this interest in the changing effects of light and atmosphere on the viewer's perception from different times of the day, with different seasons, and in different weather. So he made several of these series, his Haystack series being one of the most famous. In this case, we show you the Rouen Cathedral, whereby in the 1890s he makes a series of studies at different times of the day illustrating the effects this has on actual objects and showing us that our optical viewing of the world is actually quite subjective to these conditions, these atmospheric conditions. So here, showing you paintings that he made from early afternoon until the evening, you are able to see the building and the facade here of this Gothic church slowly dissolving at twilight into the warm, hazy, orange and yellowish colors to the bluish violet cool colors, and then it seems to completely dissolve at twilight and disintegrate, the details becoming very unfocused, and thus of course illustrating how our perception of reality is highly dependent upon the time of day, the season, and atmospheric elements. Right, so the subject, very importantly, is not really what we see, but instead how we experience it changes the subject radically. Now, the artist who would be trained with Monet in the same studio of Charles Glier is that of Pierre-Auguste Renoir. And Renoir is going to be the first artist to apply the sketchy, unfinished brushwork that is so popular and famous with Impressionism to human figures. So he was trained in a porcelain factory, thus he is going to be well-versed in painting human figures. He, unlike Monet, generally chooses to paint middle-class individuals in their leisurely time, in this case, men and women dancing together at an open-air dance hall called Le Moulin de la Galette, which is right next to Le Moulin Rouge on Montmartre. This is going to be in the summer, an open-air area where young men and women could gather together and dance, right, appropriately and with chaperones. So here we find that the group on the dance floor are going about their activities, whereas these young women are going to be flirted with by these men sitting across from them on this bench. The brushstrokes that are used to illustrate the figures are very blotchy, unfinished, and are otherwise not used to detail what is happening, but instead just suggest the shimmering nature of light coming through these trees as the figures dance. Thus we get a momentary glimpse of their activities instead of the completely focused and detailed rendering and classical composition more common with academic painting. Now, Renoir is also going to detail the new city that Parisians were living in. In his painting of Le Pont Neuf, or the New Bridge, literally a newly constructed bridge in Paris, we have an image of figures hustling and bustling about, going about their daily lives. And the next minute, of course, like the clouds above, floating across the sky, they too will move off into the distance, quickly going about their lives. This is modernity in flux. And to us today, we might not realize how strange and new this would have been to people looking at it. Because in the 1850s, Paris had reached more than 1.5 million residents. And the medieval city, which had very narrow, crooked streets, it was lacking in proper sewage systems. And you find that we did not have the infrastructure to support this new bustling metropolis. So they began to reconstruct the entire city, bulldozing entire neighborhoods, turning it into the first modern city as we know it, right? A new modern metropolis complete with avenues and parks and public buildings, right? With, of course, street lights where people could shop at night, go to cafes in the evening, and thus, of course, enjoy themselves. Now, this is known to Parisians as Haussmannization because it was a German named Haussmann who redesigned the city at the time under the Emperor Napoleon II. So we find here we have a new sewer system built, new train stations. He had wider thoroughfares added for carriages to carry people to and fro. He added gas street lamps to encourage nightlife and people to stroll about at night, not to be afraid of being mugged and or having any type of physical accosting happening to them. He, of course, is going to add street patrols, right? Making this a tourist destination to where you would go about and be seen on the streets in the latest fashion, being entertained in these cafe concerts. So this is what Parisians would have seen at the time. Here's a photograph, a contemporaneous photograph of Hippolyte Joudon, whereby we're going to see the new bridge with people dressed in contemporary attire, all of this being brand new for Parisians, many of them upset with losing the medieval character and the individuality of the different regions. Now they bemoaned the uniformity where everything looked modern and new. So we find that modernity here with Impressionism and in these paintings, which are left unfinished and very sketchy, is meant to represent that lack of fixity and of certainty that people were feeling at the time. These new modern structures, these new bridges, these new, once again, apartment buildings. You find that modern urban life becomes the subject for Impressionists. Now, how they're going to illustrate that and convey this discomfort or disjointedness felt by many Parisians is going to come from a non-Western source. So we find that Japonisme, or Japanese woodblocks, which are collected by Parisians and modern artists in the 19th century, are used as a model for Impressionists to create this new modern art. Japonisme is going to use oblique angles, generally from above looking down, unconventional asymmetrical compositions, right? So instead of having subjects always dead center in a work of art, they're generally offset or awkwardly cropped. Thus we feel the slight confusion and disorientation, a different way of viewing the world than is customary in academic painting, but is very appropriate if you're trying to show how new things feel to people and how different things are. So just as with Le Moulin de la Galette here with Renoir, we have this shifting being felt, the impermanence, where the woman at the far left is going to be transected or cut off, awkwardly cropped. The man to the far right, his shoulder being cut off. These figures, right, in this diagonal composition are unable to reach one another because of the bench in between them. The dancing play of light coming through the trees on the dancing couples will look different in the next moment. Thus capturing the essence of modernity, which is in flux, which is always changing. Now, an artist who did not use the characteristic impressionistic brushwork, but adopted many of the same compositional devices, is Gustave Courbet. Now, unlike most of the Impressionists, Courbet is wealthy and actually paid for many of the early Impressionist exhibition spaces and helped them early on as a patron. So he is known for his street walking scenes and reviving an interest in the male nude among modern artists. In his painting at the Art Institute of Chicago, seen here, Paris, A Rainy Day of 1877, we have a work that obviously used photographs when assembling it because it does have a photographic quality to it. However, we find that it is still asymmetrically oblique and disjointed, like Renoir's impressions we saw a moment ago of Japonisme. In the work, we find a rainy day with individuals dressed in black, carrying their umbrellas, going various directions. We are supposedly on a sidewalk looking slightly down at an oblique angle, this couple walking towards us, while a gentleman to the far right is awkwardly cropped right down the middle. We find that the couple looks off to their right to direct our attention to these men that are wearing black and carrying the same umbrellas, walking then to the right. So we have a large open expanse in the center left that's going to echo the wide open bright sky. Now, the photographs used, which very often were destroyed by modern artists because they did not want to be accused of copying, demonstrate his knowledge of the distortive qualities of lenses, but then also accurately capturing the view of the new modern city streets and housemanization. We find that the awkward cropping again is also going to be derived from that approach seen with Renoir. So we have a very asymmetrical scene with most of the positive space on the right-hand side of the composition, but a very disjointed approach, right, in which figures are not looking at nor are they acknowledging one another. You find that instead, our viewing angle is always going to be directing us to another object, another person, who then is going to direct our attention back. So we are walking on the sidewalk closest to this man and woman, but they do not acknowledge us. They look off to the right. Thus, we look off to the right to see no focal point, no focalizer. Instead, we have various other figures that are going about their own days in different directions. Therefore, we have this disjointedness, this discomfort that is very common in modern life with this new alien environment and city, the city of the tourist, not of Parisians as they thought. All right, so just to show you the composition divided in half or transected with this lamppost is going to bring our attention inward as we're walking on the sidewalk towards the couple, who then direct our attention off to our left. But there is nothing there as they draw our attention back. Thus, there is no focal point in modernity, and everything is changing and everyone is moving and it will be in flux. Continuing this interest in disjuncture and using japonisme as a compositional device, we have Edward Manet in his bar at the Folies Bergère, which he exhibits with the Impressionists in 1882, where we find ourselves supposedly standing across from a barmaid who has a variety of offerings around her, such as champagne, Bass ale, absinthe, oranges, and flowers in a vase. Whereas behind her, we suggest that there is a mirror with a stage and then a trapeze artist with her feet seen in the upper left-hand corner. Whereas off to the right, we seemingly have a reflection of the barmaid and then a man wearing a top hat with a mustache and a goatee. So this we initially assume would be us walking up to and asking this woman for a beverage. However, we find that she seems to look through us vacantly instead of emotionally engaging on a personal level. So we find that in these establishments, very often, the bartenders would also double as prostitutes. And so it is very possible that we could be either asking her for a beverage or her after-hours services. They would often have rooms upstairs. So she seems very disinterested in either of those propositions. Now, the original sketch for the bar at the Folies Bergère is very telling that Manet is going to leave us behind an example here of his process, which is to confuse the viewer even further about our relationship to the painting. For originally, she had blonde hair, the barmaid did, and her reflection lines up fairly well with her. It actually overlaps her, whereas she looks down and to our right at this man wearing a bowler hat. Now, at this angle, we would be able to see the painting without our head being in the way. Therefore, it more accurately records what a mirror image would actually do. In the final version, you'll notice he moves the reflection far to the right, along with the gentleman who's much taller. Therefore, if we look carefully at the painting, we are unsure. Are we looking at a mirror reflection of ourselves that is just slightly distorted? Or are these two other individuals? We find that critics at the time believed that this was her sister being chatted up by another gentleman behind her. Right? So this is going to be purposeful on the part of Manet, with the awkward cropping, with the strange angles. Even though we have a figure directly in front of us, what is our relationship to her? So this still shows the modern activities and leisurely activities of the bourgeoisie going out for a night of entertainment at a club, but shows how unsure we are of our relationships with other people. So this is the essence of modernity, this fleeting encounter between these individuals, superficial contact. Are they merely going to exchange goods or services momentarily and never see each other again? Do they have any connection to one another emotionally, financially, or otherwise? We are left unclear on that, just as in life we are unsure of everyone we pass on the streets and those individuals that we engage with. So we find the same thing to be true of Caillebot's Paris, a Rainy Day. What are the relationships of these individuals? Do they know one another? Even the couple that are going to be sharing the same umbrella. Is that his wife, or is that going to be a courtesan? Is it a prostitute? Is it his mistress? We don't know what the relationship of individuals actually are. Turning to a very popular Impressionist painter, Edgar Degas, we have an individual who is very disinterested, unlike Monet, in light and atmospheric effects. In fact, he uses a good deal of black in his works. So he does not have the same interest in optical illusions or color theory. Instead, his interest will be in fields and angles of vision and the perception of moving bodies. Hence, he's most famous for painting urban indoor scenes, generally of the ballet. So here we have the rehearsal on stage of 1874, painted around the time of the first Impressionist exhibition, where we are not looking at the main event of ballerinas performing. Instead, we are looking behind the stage. We are looking at the rehearsal for the main event, where all of the ballerinas are not even engaged in practicing. Instead, we have those awkwardly cropped off to the left, cut right down the middle, awaiting their turn. Others stretching in the mid-foreground, whereas we even have the handles of musical instruments blocking our view to the foreground left, you can see here. Whereas, once again, the composer is going to be directing the three in the center who are actually practicing. Whereas in the far background to the right, we have two middle-class gentlemen watching the performance, this rehearsal. So if you compare it to those earlier examples we looked at, like Le Moulin de la Galette and Monet and Caillebotte, you can see that it uses the same Japonisme when it comes to the compositional devices. We are hovering slightly above the scene at an oblique angle. The figures are awkwardly cropped. They are cut off. The main action is not in the center of the painting. It is off axis to the right background. We find that the rest of the scene is left quite sketchy and unfinished, but it is still a momentary or fleeting moment of entertainment for the bourgeoisie that will change in the next moment and the next scene, that will not be the same. The same can be seen in actual examples of Japonisme prints, in which we're going to have oblique angles, it being off-axis. The perspectival system also unclear as to, for instance, where the orthogonals are, where the vanishing point is, as we're going to be left tilting our perspective and thus unsure of the main subject and the center of the work. Now, following the Impressionists, we have the Post-Impressionists, and there are two varieties of Post-Impressionism. The first is going to be seen in the works of Vincent van Gogh, and we find that Van Gogh is going to represent the expressionistic approach that follows the Impressionists. So post, meaning after, is a definitive break with Impressionism, specifically by way of application of paint and or subject and how it is represented. So Van Gogh and others are going to appreciate the expressionistic abilities of paint and color and brushwork that might show the same subjects as the Impressionists, such as landscapes or leisurely activities, but in an entirely new way. Now, Van Gogh is famous for his personal life and his very dramatic death, supposedly with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. We know that he's Dutch. He's from the Netherlands and the son of a Dutch Protestant pastor, which he also wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, but could not pass the theological exams. He suffers repeated professional failures and tries to be a broker, a dealer like his brother. He tries to be a pastor. He tries to be a painter, and he fails at every enterprise. One of the reasons for the difficulties he suffered from was the fact that he was an epileptic and repeatedly had epileptic seizures that led to bouts of severe depression, which he institutionalizes himself for repeatedly as well. We know that he's largely self-taught. His style is very unique and amateurish, and that he represents the avant-garde, that being the forward-thinking artist at the time who would move the style of abstraction forward. Now, we know a great deal about his life through the letters he wrote to his brother Theo from 1872 to 1890, we have nearly 700 letters. So we know on a daily basis what he was thinking and what his interests were. Now, he states expressly in his letters, often writing to his brother, that he will use color more arbitrarily so as to express himself more forcefully. Thus, he's not using paint and color to accurately and objectively represent the world, but instead, through an expressionistic fashion, show us how he feels about the world. That can be seen very clearly in his most famous work, arguably, The Starry Night of 1889, painted shortly before his supposed suicide. Now, The Starry Night, it takes its name from the majority of the composition, which is given up to a night sky and these glowing stars, with a new type of impasto application of paint that is left very unblended and built up on the surface. The subject is actually going to be painted from the window of the insane asylum where he checked himself in outside Saint-Remy. So you're looking at the town of Saint-Remy down here in the lower foreground, whereas a giant cypress tree is going to occupy the left-hand part of the composition. Cypress trees, of course, being planted around cemeteries and relating to death. Now, here is the difference between Post-Impressionism and Impressionism, in that for Post-Impressionism, with Van Gogh, none of us would expect to believe that this is how we would actually view the world. Instead, it is how the artist is going to perceive things, perceive the world, and thus, once again, show us how he is feeling, building up the surface with a swirling, powerful series of strokes, much like a tidal wave. Whereas, if we look at Renoir, sure, we would agree that these figures are unfinished, and it is left fleeting and unsure as to where they are going, and who they are. But we would all agree that the sky is blue, the clouds are going to be light and fluffy, and are going to be dancing across the surface of the painting relatively easily, and that the ground and the concrete used to pour the bridge is the appropriate color, and that this is how we would objectively see a quickly painted scene. As opposed to Van Gogh's example, where this is entirely his impression. Now, this is influenced by Japanese woodblock prints, or Japonisme again, which we know Van Gogh copies identically several times. He's actually going to paint after these Japanese woodblock prints and make exact copies of them. So obviously, the swirling nature of the wave above is going to be the impetus, the model, the reason why we have such a solid understanding of the sky swirling about us at the time. Now, the reason for such a violent torrential tsunami in the sky is the reflection on death, which is what we're looking at here. As Van Gogh is looking outside of his asylum window, he's contemplating what happens to people once they die. Thus, we have symbols of death with the church and the graveyard referenced by the cypress trees, and the belief that when you die, your soul is going to become a star in the sky. This is something he writes to his brother repeatedly, right? So he finds this is a meditation on death, as he believes he will be absorbed into the universe, a glorious last freeing transformation that he is looking forward to. And obviously a very personal interpretation of this landscape with Saint-Remy, right? And thus, of course, making it post-impressionist. The artist who often worked with Van Gogh, but moves even further afield, is Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin is also going to practice this expressionistic approach to Impressionism as a post-impressionist. He has a very innovative avant-garde technique, and he liberates the brushstroke from its formal obligations even further than Van Gogh. We know that he's born in Peru, his family moves to France, and once he loses his job as a successful stockbroker in 1882, he decides to make his career as an amateur amateur painter, taking lessons with Pissarro and moving to Pont-Aven, Brittany, and finally all the way to French Polynesia in Tahiti. So in 1888, he makes this move to escape from the civilized world, to escape from everything that is happening in Paris that he feels is holding him back from an understanding of primitivism, or of primitive people, as they would call it, who see the world more innocently and thus more spiritually. So he moves into the countryside, living with Tahitian women, learning their language somewhat, and learning to incorporate their objects and their motifs into his painting. Here, in The Spectre Watches Over Her, we have a painting of the painter's teenage mistress. So in this case, the mistress is going to be in a panic, we are told in a letter, because she imagines being surrounded by ghosts, the incarnation of which can be seen in the darkly complected one at the bedpost in the upper left-hand corner. We also have the title of the painting in Tahitian written above his head. So we find that this is also commenting on the tradition of the reclining female nude. But according to this tradition, it is even more scandalous. It is even more modern and avant-garde, for we're substituting a white woman for a darkly complected one. Therefore, they are sexualizing an inferior race, as it was considered anthropologically in the late 19th century. You do not see images of nude sexualized non-European women. They're always going to be white and Caucasian. So in this case, seemingly it is more appropriate because she's lying on her stomach, hiding, right, her genitalia and her breasts. But the implications are even more scandalous because of the position of what we do not see and the implication of her passively inviting the viewer's gaze back in. So a very different interpretation from that scene in Manet's Olympia. Now, he wants to get away from modernity and thus, of course, escape to primitivism. So what we find here commonly is referred to as the colonization of the body, whereas you find that the peoples occupying the areas of French and European colonization were once again a substitute for colonizing the entire country. So once again, they see the women as the right to do as they wish. Thus, once again, you have in a post-colonial fashion, we'll discuss later, a very open and clear statement on the power that Western nations felt they had over others. Now, this is, of course, going to evoke a mood or a state of mind. Thus, regardless of the colonial implications, it is not realistically painted. It is flattened out in the background. Much abstraction has been incorporated in the scene. Thus, of course, the intent is not realism. The intent is to let you know how the artist felt about it, showing you this panicked young woman. Now, turning to the other variety of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism per se, we have Georges Seurat. So Seurat is going to develop one of the most famous types of painting and techniques, and that's going to be pointillism or divisionism, whereby he separates out color into its distinct components, whereby pure color will then blend optically in the eye, giving us a type of science of the art. In his most famous work, painted shortly before his death, The Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte, we have a work that is exhibited in the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886. The subject is also like the Impressionists. This is a massive life-size painting in the Chicago Art Institute that shows us the leisurely activities of the bourgeoisie as they are lounging on this island nicknamed the Big Bowl, Le Grand Jatte, in the middle of the Seine on a Sunday afternoon. Now, the entire painting is made up of tiny, uniform dots of color or pigment, right, known as chromoluminarianism by Seurat, whereby he is attempting to break down, using optics and color theory, the way in which we perceive color at a distance. Thus, there is no black and shadows if you look carefully. Instead, we have a range of blues, oranges, violets, and greens, right? So these complementary colors can be found in shadows, showing how vibrant they are instead of dull. Now, this is always going to blend in the eye at a distance. Using as his starting point a base color, he then uses a local color such as green and then breaks it down with touches of blue, dark green, light green, and orange, thus showing us how we actually perceive the world with his very meticulous approach. In his preparatory studies for the work, one can see how he conceived of and separated these various hues, starting with a basic base color like dark green, then breaking that down to its constituencies of violets, light greens, oranges, yellows, much like the standing couple and the woman with the parasol and the monkey on the leaf. Now, this is a much more systematic and scientific method of paint application than had been used by the Impressionists with their random daubing technique, leaving things sketched and unblended. Instead, the effect of this very deliberate division of hues is going to be one of stable symmetry and a grid-like pattern that's going to be imposed on a scene that is very similar to the subjects used by the earlier Impressionists. So we find that the effect is one of a fixed approach to this Sunday afternoon scene, not a fleeting moment awkwardly cropped and seen at an oblique angle, but a classical composition where we can lay over it a grid where the figures all conform to their sections of the composition, and it gently rolls out from, again, the left and to the right, as far as these couples and figures lounging out on the side and the banks of the Seine. Now, the final artist we'll be discussing today is Paul Cézanne, representing, like Seurat, the analytical and scientific approach to painting that will give rise to the styles in the early 20th century, including Cubism and Futurism. Now, his was a belief that art needed to be timeless and permanent, meaning that he believed that Impressionism would not be durable, would not last the ages and the test of time. So he wanted to take Impressionism, the subjects of Impressionism, and make them something solid and durable, as he states, like the art of the museums. He received repeated negative receptions when he worked in Paris, so retired, and for the rest of his career painted around Aix-en-Provence, eventually reaching a revolutionary new approach that is going to certainly win him the title of the father of Cubism. In works like Mont Saint-Victoire, or Mount St. Victor here, which is right outside of his home, right in this area in southern France, we have a mountain with trees and then a series of meadows and structures below. Now, if you look at a painting of and then a photograph of the same scene, one can tell why he is going to be referred to as the father of Cubism. He made hundreds of drawings and 30-plus paintings of this specific mountain, where he does not attempt to render the atmospheric effects of it at different times of the day, nor is he trying to suggest that modernity is something in flux. Instead, like that of Seurat and the scientific approach to painting, he attempts to break down the composition to its variant constituencies, elements, and geometrization. So we find that he is uninterested in the early or late studies of lighting and atmospheric effects of Monet. Instead, everything is always presented at the same time of the day, at high noon, where everything can very clearly and crisply be identified. Then he's going to break down the landscape to its specific geometric planes as though it's underlying nature, attempting to find out how the landscape is built up on the surface. And this, of course, is going to contest the illusionism of the scene. Thus, we find the consistent struggle in the 20th century between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. For both of these works certainly represent something that we could easily identify in reality, but we see how they are constructed. We can literally see the paint that brings this illusion together. Thus, we will have this struggle between illusionism and artistry up until its complete abstraction with abstract expressionism. So you can see with a detail how he is building up the scene, restricting it to these vertical, horizontal, and diagonal strokes, trying to see how the landscape, plane by plane, builds up section by section. So these are the 2 directions of art that we will discuss in the 20th century. On the one hand, we have Van Gogh and Gauguin representing the expressionistic approach, which will lead to styles such as Fauvism and Expressionism, and then eventually Surrealism, and then abstract expressionism. The expressionistic approach of art, showing us how the artist feels and views the world, versus the analytical approach represented by Seurat and Cezanne, whereby artists are going to attempt through different types of scientific investigations, looking at the world and breaking it down into its constituent components by way of space and time in styles such as Cubism and Futurism, Constructivism and Vorticism that we will discuss. We'll look at the end of the 19th century before turning our attention to the 20th, with the last 2 styles to be discussed in Symbolism and Art Nouveau. Before turning to those styles, however, we should discuss James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who is going to be involved in a movement in England that will be very revolutionary and fundamentally important for modern art moving forward. Technically, Whistler was an American artist who will grow up in New England. He studies in Russia, then in France, befriending Courbet, and finally he moves to England where he befriends the Pre-Raphaelites, specifically Rossetti. He's going to be involved in, as the Pre-Raphaelites were, the l'art pour l'art, or art for art's sake movement. Seminal and very important for modern art, this aesthetic movement, as it becomes known, is going to believe that the role of art is not to moralize or be didactic, not to teach us a moral lesson or instruct us in religion, for instance, nor is it even for entertainment on the purposes of the viewer, but instead its purpose is art itself. It needs no other purpose beyond it exists. Now, this is going to find the abandonment of subject matter to fully embrace form and formal qualities. And the precedent for this type of work is found in music, and this is cited by aesthetes like Whistler and the Pre-Raphaelites, and so they will start entitling their works with musical titles such as symphony, sonata, or nocturne. We find that Whistler is most famous, possibly, for his painting of his mother, otherwise known as Whistler's Mother. However, the proper title for the work is actually The Arrangement in Gray and Black from 1871. In the work, we find that the fact that his mother is present is incidental. Instead, what we have is a compositional arrangement, as the title suggests, with these overlapping planes and forms of black and white. Now, the same can be true when he finally abandons subject matter almost entirely later in his career. Here, just 4 years later, we find Whistler, as an aesthete, is going to devote his attention to landscape, the only aesthete to do so, or the artist that's going to be practicing art for art's sake. Here in the Nocturne in Black and Gold, or The Falling Rocket, the title suggests 2 things. One, a musical accompaniment and or composition, and the other is the more naturalistic representation for what this references. Now, the term nocturne would remind people of piano compositions of a meditative character, particularly of Chopin and other classical composers, that would take place at night, hence this painting is a nocturnal scene. Additionally, we find that what is shown, the title suggests, of the falling rocket is certainly fireworks, but we do not see in the Cremorne Gardens in London, where this is actually taking place, a very realistic landscape. Here we have a painting of what it would look like objectively in the upper left. Instead, we're going to evoke the magical mood of the glowing sparks that are falling back to Earth after their ascent to the heavens. And we have, of course, a limited color scheme with blues and blacks that are going to be in the background, illuminated intermittently by these bright bursts of color. Now, this is going to find its precedent in Turner, the British artist who nearly completely frees the brushwork, as we discussed, from its mimetic or descriptive responsibilities, instead communicating the power of the brushwork and of abstraction to still communicate a believable landscape setting and scene. So we have these daubs of paint added instead of carefully blended, and this is the precedent for this type of near complete abstraction. Now, we find that not everyone appreciated the aesthetic approach practiced here by Whistler and seen earlier by Turner. We find that the most powerful art critic of the day, John Ruskin, is going to criticize Whistler publicly for his lack of detail and for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, criticizing him for charging the same amount for this painting as a more traditional realistic academic painting. Whistler in turn sued for libel, and we have following this the Whistler-Ruskin trial, which becomes the test case for the theory of art for art's sake. That being, can art merely be? Does it need to be incredibly well crafted and finished? Does it need to clearly teach us a moral lesson or how to live our lives? Whistler asserts, on the other hand, that art was nothing but an artistic arrangement. Therefore, that's all it needed to be and do, and he said he succeeded in accomplishing this task. Now, we find this becomes the central tenet of modernism, in that art does not have to have a moral imperative, nor does it have to look realistic, which leads us in a new direction in the art world in the 20th century. Now, we find that Whistler wins the case. The crowd is very receptive, and so are the lawyers and the judge to his argument. He's very witty, but he goes bankrupt in the process, because in the 19th century in England, those that do the suing have to pay all of the bills for both parties involved. So he won, but lost all of his money regardless. Now, it even is going to inspire the fine art production of post-impressionists like Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. So Toulouse-Lautrec comes from an aristocratic family where his parents were cousins, and so you find he's going to be born with congenital defects. His legs actually stop growing at adolescence, and he has a full-size torso, but only reaches 5 feet tall. Now, because his parents were perennially penniless, and because of his physical deformity as he sees it, he's drawn to nightlife, nightclubs, cabarets, and brothels, and is going to produce posters, especially for and subjects of these locations, in order to pay for his time there. So at the time he would spend at bars and cabarets and brothels, he would make them designs in order to ensure his bill was paid by the end of the night. Now, unfortunately, he dies in a sanatorium from syphilis and alcoholism at the end of his life, but is going to be the most original poster designer of the fin du siècle, or the end of the century in Paris. Now here we have his Jane Avril, one of the most radical departures from standard poster design, where we are inviting people outside to come in and watch this performer who dances in this burlesque fashion, showing her undergarments, while the orchestra pit below can be seen and music being played simultaneously. Now we find that the curvilinear patterns, whereby the hand and the arm of the musical instrument are going to blend into the frame that surrounds the performer and her name at the top. And we find that the head of the musician below also is going to have these whiplash-like designs from Art Nouveau. Now this is going to also be influenced by the same type of art the Impressionists so loved, that being Japonisme, where we have large flat areas of color and the subject is going to be moved off to the distance, right, nearly cut off, much like we see in Japanese woodblock prints trying to find the subject here of Mount Fuji, which is pushed all the way into the background. Now, this is the same subject that we find with Impressionism as well. The entertainments of the bourgeoisie, what the middle class were doing, being entertained in cafe concerts, going to the ballet. And again, we still have that oblique angle, the awkward cropping, looking at something in an unusual way. But now, Toulouse-Lautrec takes it even further, stripping it down even further to its essentials with these very flat areas. And then the framing device in a very unusual way, moving around the work, tying the very far foreground to the background. Now, Post-Impressionists, we already looked at with Van Gogh and Gogh, were already developing away from the world of appearances, turning further and further inward, showing us what they felt about the world, not what it looked like. Now we find that Gustave Moreau is going to call Van Gogh and Gogh symbolists even before the term was popularized. Now symbolism is known as the painting of ideas, whereby material reality is thought to hide another, more true spiritual reality behind it. Now the essence of that new invisible spiritual reality can only be expressed through art. Thus we can only see the truth through art, as the symbolists would state. So we find this is going to become a flight from the modern world, an escape into the dream world especially, replacing clear narrative with subjective feeling and imagination. We have a series of artists like Moreau that are going to avoid the literal everyday subjects like the Impressionists. Instead, they will often turn to literary or biblical symbolism in stories from the Bible or mythology. In this case, we have the apparition, right, where we find the entire surface of the painting is mobilized to convey the meaning, where we find the severed head of John the Baptist still bleeding on the floor in a puddle is going to be haunting the figures, especially Salome, who has just danced for her stepfather Herod in the background, and her mother, as Herod had granted her whatever she wished, and the stepmother asked for the head of St. John the Baptist. Now we find it coming back, juxtaposing the erotic and the macabre at the same time. Her beauty led to this man's death. And we find this is very common in these dream-like scenes. Now, this is not entirely unusual, and we find that the spiritual visions were already illustrated by artists like Gauguin and Van Gogh, where they would try to show and illustrate these scenes from the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. In this case, of course, Salome is going to be taken from the New Testament with John the Baptist. An artist who would certainly carry on the juxtaposition between the macabre and the erotic is also Edvard Munch, a Norwegian artist who's trained in Oslo. We find that he then finishes his artistic training in Paris in 1889. But while he's away at school, his father dies, and he falls into a deep depression, having not been there for him. He becomes obsessed with death and the meaning of life and death, especially in this existentialist, angst-ridden quest to understand why we live, why we die. A perfect example of symbolism, for his work does not show us what the world actually looks like, but instead the truth behind it, the anxieties we feel about it. The most famous painting by Munch, arguably, is his Scream of 1893, where we find it signed and dated in the lower left-hand corner. We find a bald figure in the foreground, right on the vertical axis, has his hands up to his head, screaming with his mouth open, eyes wide open agape. Whereas he's on a bridge, a sharply foreshortened bridge, with two shadowy figures wearing top hats that are going to be striding towards him, yet they are pushed off far into the background left. The horizon is going to undulate in the curvilinear fashion as the sky turns blood red, and we find it's going to be alternating with these yellows and oranges. Now this expresses the same type of feeling, the sublime feeling of Friedrich's Monk by the Sea, whereby, and that's exactly what Munch is trying to demonstrate, is this existential angst and primal fear before the immensity of nature, how large the world is and how insignificant we are. What is our role in it? How do we understand it? As the artist is going to explain, this is actually taken from a biographical account, where one day out walking with two of his friends across a bridge, he supposedly heard a scream, very subtly at first, echoing throughout nature, that became louder and louder and louder until he himself began screaming along with it, and the sky seemed to turn red. Now, obviously, this is not how he would have actually seen this objectively. We find that we're distorting how he felt about it in order to communicate a truth behind how things appear, using those same curvilinear whiplash forms from Art Nouveau. But now, instead of trying to show something that is organic and or erotic, we are now going to be showing the anxiety and the expressionistic fear and angst felt by the artist as the self-portrait is painted in the foreground. Now, this, of course, is not how the scene would have appeared. More so, we would agree objectively on the left-hand painting with Caillebott's Paris, a Rainy Day. And thereby, we understand the reflection off the cobblestones of the rain. We understand the clothing and how detailed the figures seem to appear, even though they are slightly distorted and seen from an oblique angle and cut off. But that is not the point of symbolism, and especially not the Scream, which asks us to imagine and empathize with the fear and the angst felt by the artist at this moment as he is externalizing this experience. Now, this anxiety and angst is going to be expressed symbolically, not realistically, as in Hodler's example, yet they both seek the same thing, to show us the truth behind the literal world, behind the physical world, showing us the spiritual truth of things. The same can be said of the greatest sculptor of the late and early 20th century, and that's going to be Auguste Rodin. Rodin is called the symbolist, and he will express the spiritual in a very commonplace and accessible way, which is why critics will scorn him, greatly dislike him, and write horrible reviews about him, but the public greatly admires his work. After traveling to Italy in 1875, he's going to develop this vigorously modeled style and these contorted poses, which pave the way for sculptural abstraction, but excellently will show us the internal torment and or angst of these figures. An example of this can be seen in a public commission for the burghers of Calais, an episode illustrating life-size figures of burghers or leaders of France in the city of Calais during the 100 Years' War, where England will lay siege to the city, and they agree to spare the city if they will send out 6 of their leaders dressed in this humiliating sackcloth with rope halters around their neck, much like they're going to the gallows to be hung. They will carry the keys to the city and surrender for their execution. If you look at the figures, they are going to not be anatomically correct, not realistically rendered, but instead they are symbolically expressive, having large hands, oversized heads. Their gestures and their directionality is lumbering and slow as they are trudging their way towards their death. Now this is anti-heroic because if you were to think of someone sacrificing themselves for their community, that is a heroic act. And in the past it has been shown, as you see in the painting in the bottom right, as people very dramatically standing up, chins held high, staring death in the face. Now they are shown as humans that are going to experience the same anguish and despair that the rest of us would, knowing we are going to our death. Regardless of the reason why we are doing it, it would still be an incredibly emotionally weighty event. Finally, we will round out this class by discussing the new modern approach to architecture with steel and reinforced concrete, which is going to begin adopted in 1890 to 1910, where we see the development of high-strength structural steel being used alone or with a reinforcing material in concrete, otherwise known as rebar, as we might understand it. Now here we have Louis Sullivan in the Wainwright Building in St. Louis being one of the first structures to use a multi-story steel frame construction, showing us what is possible with this new type of construction that will reach grand new heights, that will give us new shapes of cities and ways to live. So we find that here is a photograph of the building under construction showing you the steel skeleton and the framework that makes it up as they construct it from the bottom up, laying floor by floor. Now you find that the exterior design is going to reflect the internal steel frame, though at the turn of the century they still appreciate to skin it and or add additional decorative flourishes to the exterior. So just like construction sites today, you have this steel frame, which then you will pour concrete around reinforced bars or rebar in order to hold up these various floors. Now, interestingly enough, none of this would have been popular without the invention of elevators, which happened in America as well. So we find that in America, the notion of steel and reinforced concrete structures only is made possible as far as its logistical aspects of living and working in these high-rises if we have a way in which to move very quickly and easily from all of the various levels, from top to bottom. You couple this finally with new heating and cooling technologies that come along mid-century, and we will have the new skyscrapers of the late 20th. All right, so this is when we see the futuristic dreams coming true of a group of individuals known as Futurists in Europe, who are going to demand the destruction of everything old and to make way for everything new, these new futuristic cities where we all will live in skyscrapers and drive automobiles and fly in airplanes. But in order to get there, we need a world war. This lecture begins the 20th century, a very exciting time for art in which we have many avant-garde movements happening and working simultaneously throughout Europe and then in the mid to late 20th century America. Now, where we left off with symbolism and post-impressionism, art is going to take two different directions in the 20th century. Either the expressionistic approach of Van Gogh, Gogh, and those attempting not to show what reality looks like objectively, but instead to reveal something of a deeper truth, spiritual or otherwise. Then you will have the second direction, the analytical approach, the scientific approach, seen in the work of Cezanne and Seurat, where we try to develop and understand the underlying structures of our world through science and through various investigations. The first variety can be seen in Henri Matisse, who in his avant-garde movement, which of course is going to be a forward-thinking style that is going to move us ahead, hence avant before garde, the before guard that goes out ahead of the rest of the army as a scouting troop. So the avant-garde is going to be an approach that will come to define all of the styles we will discuss for the rest of this class. All of them are new, forward-thinking, and move us ahead. Now, this particular version of avant-garde style is going to be known as Fauvism, that Henri Matisse practices. Fauvism is going to first be exhibited at the Salon d'Automne, or the Autumn Salon, in 1905, along with many other modern works. Now, the term Fauvism comes from the French fauve, meaning wild beast, because critics stated that the artists must have been wild beasts to paint as such. Now, the reasoning behind the odd, we might say, color choices and application techniques of Matisse and other Fauvists might be explained by Matisse's own ideas that he shares early on in his career, stating that color was not given to us so that we could imitate nature. It was given to us so that we can express our emotions, which would, of course, ring very true to earlier expressionistic artists like Van Gogh. Now here, in Woman with a Hat, you have an excellent example of Fauvism from the early 20th century, and especially the Salon d'Automne of 1905, showcasing the non-representational color and brushwork that the style becomes known for. The woman in the painting, a three-quarter length portrait, much like the Mona Lisa, of a woman seated in a chair turning towards us, is going to actually be of his wife Amélie. So here she is in an actual chair to show you the difference in the Fauvist approach and then an objective photographic one. Obviously, the choices made by Matisse were not to reflect how she actually appeared in reality. Instead, we would agree that Impressionists such as Bert Morisot much more effectively captured what we would agree a woman seated out in the grass would look like wearing a hat. Of course, the flesh tone of her face, the brown or brunette color of her hair, the green of the grass, the white of her dress. All of these are going to be objective color choices. Matisse, on the other hand, has chosen radically different colors that do not define the structures and the objects that they seem to be on. Whereas her face is going to transition between yellows and whites, and then sky blues and greens, to reds, then an orange and yellow in her neck. Her hat is going to be a kaleidoscope of various violets, blues, oranges. And even, of course, the background is not painted radically differently than the foreground. So we have completely arbitrary juxtapositions between her neck and then the blue directly behind it, or the aqua green on the right-hand side of the composition. Now, these color choices, which are not naturalistic, are not new. We saw them with the Post-Impressionists, especially Van Gogh and Gogh, who, through the use of arbitrary colors, or those that are not meant to reflect or represent what necessarily is being painted, are to emphasize an evocative emotional response from the spectator. Later in Matisse's career, he separates from his wife in 1939. He has a colonostomy in 1941, which confines him to a wheelchair. At that point, his later works are going to be famously known as painting with scissors, where he's going to sit in a wheelchair and cut out these various shapes, instructing his students, his apprentices, to put them in predictable patterns, to continue this interest in challenging the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional. Now turning to the next avant-garde movement, we have Expressionism. Here we have the leader of Die Brücke, one of the movements inside Expressionism in Germany, and that's Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, the head of the Bridge. And it's called the Bridge because they wished in their manifesto explaining this to bridge the old and the new, to bridge again the medieval spiritual approach to living and life in Germany, or German medieval art, with that of modernity. So we find that in Kirchner's work and in Die Brücke in general, they will model their lives and their art on medieval craft guilds, sharing things, working in communities. And this is one of the approaches and reactions to the Industrial Revolution and urbanization in many cities in Europe. Here, in his Street Berlin, 1913, we have an excellent example of the expressionistic qualities that do not seek to show us something that is realistic or objective, but instead to reveal the angst and the uncomfortable nature of the scene as felt by the painter, Kirchner himself, who was very agoraphobic and very uncomfortable in cities with 1 million+ people like Berlin. Here in this example, we have two prostitutes in feathered hats and fur-trimmed coats on the left, who are going to be eyeing this John on the right, who pretends not to know them or recognize them, looking instead into a shop window, showing the duplicity, if you will, of modern life and how we pretend to be one thing but are actually another, especially in public. The angular nature of the scene that is a tilted perspective and is stacked up to where there is virtually no negative space finds a counterpoint to Caillebott's Paris a Rainy Day, whereby we have the same scene, the same well-dressed figures, bourgeoisie, wearing top hats and suits, walking down the street, parading, wishing to be seen. But now we do not render them in a realistic fashion. Instead, we see the harsh angularity that threatens us, that is going to reveal the urban alienation and degeneracy that Die Brücke believes was happening in modern life, to where these figures don't even have eyes, they're maskless faces, they are dehumanized in this way. His other works also illustrating this as these hordes of zombie-like ghoulish creatures descend on the viewer. They obviously are not human, and the acidic, bright colors and juxtapositions of neon are merely reinforcing that very anxious feeling and the agoraphobia one feels being out in public. So these paintings are not what these artists actually witnessed, but instead how they felt about it. The same approach being taken from Munch's The Scream, where we have again a tilted perspective, sharp brushworks, and then biting colors here. The juxtaposition of this bright blue and pink against one another, the harsh, jutting, angular, fractured lines are not inviting but threatening in this way. Now we find that the art of Die Brücke, Kirchner, and others was labeled degenerate by the Nazis, who destroyed 600 of their works, eventually leading Kirchner to commit suicide because of fearing for his life and being sent off to a concentration camp. Now, the degenerate art show went on to be one of the most popular in all of history in Europe, traveling from city to city, showcasing modern art, trying to connect these modern artists to mental disorders and insanity. Another artist who often practiced works that would be considered degenerate is Pablo Picasso. Picasso is going to be one of the most famous artists of the 20th century, yet he does not begin as an avant-garde practitioner. Instead, he's going to graduate traditionally from Barcelona Academy of Fine Art in the 1890s, where he masters a fairly realistic technique. He then travels to Paris in 1904, where he goes through an impressionistic phase, and then the blue period, and finally a rose period. Here is a photograph of Picasso showing you his technique that develops into what he becomes famous for, and that is Cubism. But before developing along those lines, we find that when he arrives in Paris, he uses his realistic approach, such as the family of carnival workers or circus performers here, is going to be blended with the new approaches that he finds with Impressionism. And he cycles through these avant-garde styles incredibly rapidly, one after another, until he hits upon an idea that will revolutionize the art world in what has been considered the most important painting of the 20th century, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907, which is a proto-cubist work from the analytical approach we discussed with Cézanne. Hence, Cézanne is called the father of Cubism. In this work of the Ladies of Avignon, of which any viewer at the time would know they are prostitutes, because Avignon is the red light district of Barcelona, we have the approach taken by Cézanne where he breaks down nature into its geometric elements and forms, and he adds one additional consideration or component. Now, this is what was originally entitled A Philosophical Bordello by Picasso, where we would have had a John seen entering this red curtain at the left in the original sketch at the bottom right, witnessing 5 women or prostitutes that are being introduced to him by this madam in the center wearing the blue garment with a fruit still life on the table. Now, the curtains that are being pulled back and the other 2 figures, of course, are going to be simplified. We get rid of the madam, or the head of the brothel. We do away with the John, the client of the evening. Now we understand that our position is as the client, looking at these women, selecting one for the evening. They pull back the curtains and display their wares, posing provocatively, going back to the Venus of Urbino that we discussed in this class. The exposing of the armpit is a passively seductive move. It draws the viewer's attention in and objectifies, in a feminine fashion, the individual. Now, if we compare this to Fauvism, one immediately realizes that the colors are not arbitrary. He still chooses realistic colors, such as a red curtain, or the flesh tones, right, of the women, or the black of their hair, or the red of the fruit. Now, that is not unusual. What is unusual is the brushwork is going to be flat and angular, the opposite of that of Fauvism and closer to Cézanne's Post-Impressionism. But the space is what is the most interesting. If we look at the faces of the women to the right, we should note that he is modeling them on African masks from the Ivory Coast. So he is going to purchase many objects from the African colonies that France has and uses these as models to flatten out faces, to abstract them, to geometricize them, right? And so the features are what is considered at the time, quote-unquote, primitive as the culture that he's modeling it on. But it allows him to use these women or this culture as a way in which to flatten out and to decide what areas can be converted to what shapes. Now, primitivism, we should note here starting off, is going to be a common term in the early 20th century, whereby artists, earlier, if you remember the 19th century, they will exploit Japan and Japanese culture. Now they're going to exploit African culture because of colonization and the colonies that France has there. So we find that these non-Western motifs become the models for new avant-garde ways of approaching the world. Hence, now in post-colonial studies, we need to consider the idea that Western European artists stole the idea of modern art. Now, looking at the figure in the lower right-hand corner, she is the best example of the revolutionary approach Picasso has taken here to viewing and visuality. in the spatiotemporal collapse, or collapsing space and time into one flat painting, whereby we have looked at this woman the artist has from multiple angles. We view her from the back in a dorsal view, just like we see here with Degas, for instance, with her thigh seen in the right and her right elbow on her right leg. However, her head is turned in profile first with her jaw at the base that we can see here. Right here is the base of her jaw as seen from the side. Then her nose is seen from a 3/4 angle, and then finally her eye from a frontal position. Therefore, we are going to be looking at this woman from at least 4 distinct angles, as though we walked around her and recombined it onto a flat surface, like a fractured mirror frozen. So this is revolutionary because it causes us to take into account not just space, but time, and how we actually view the world as a series of small snippets taken from different viewing angles. Now, this revolutionary idea would be developed along with his partner, originally a Fauvist painter, Georges Braque, who helped Picasso in 1908 arrive at mature Cubism in 2 different varieties. So Matisse is actually going to be the artist in an interview who describes one of Braque's paintings as being made up of many tiny little cubes, petit cube as he stated. Therefore, the critic goes on to talk about this new style as being defined by cubic oddities, hence Cubism, as we would now say. Now that is of course a misnomer because there is not a single cube in Cubism, but merely flat planes that are fractured and overlapping. But the first phase of Cubism is known as analytic Cubism, whereby we analyze generally an inanimate object from multiple angles and then place that on a surface, reconstructing it. So the painting that we have here of Braque's Violin and Palette is merely a still life that is not unlike those painted for hundreds of years in Western art. Only, instead of looking at it from one angle, we are looking at the violin and the objects in the still life from multiple angles, from above, below, from the side. All of it then recombined, much like we investigate nature through Cézanne's approach in his series of Mont Saint-Victoire, where nature is broken down into its geometric constituent elements. Now we just add the interest in time of what it would be walking around these objects. And in analytic Cubism, we should add that both Picasso and Braque are going to limit the range of colors that they use to a monochromatic palette, forcing us to focus on the different planes of highlights and shadows that are going to protrude and recede as we move around them. Now, what we have as the easiest example to illustrate analytic Cubism is here's the exact type of violin that is being painted. So you'll notice that it is fractured, seen from below as we have the lip of it. The arm, the strings, of course, are going to be seen from above and then slightly from the left. And then once again, the eye holes are also going to be seen from above. So this is merely reassembled as we're going to be walking around it on one surface, flattening it back out. Turning to the second variety of Cubism, we have synthetic Cubism, whereby we are going to synthesize various media in games that we play with the spectator in a collage-like effect. So generally with collages, they're going to be made up of newspaper or actual objects that are meant to be represented, like the bottle of label of a liquor bottle here, Suze in the center, and or a newspaper which represents a newspaper. So the still life would meant to be, in this instance, a bottle of liqueur on a table with a newspaper one could be reading. Therefore, we are using the literal objects to flatten out and to give the spectator an introduction to figure this out. right? So again, the idea of a still life is nothing new, putting vases on tables with various objects. But now we're actually using the literal objects that were meant to be understood figuratively in the work, right? So instead of painting a newspaper or drawing a newspaper, we literally have it glued to the surface. Thus, it is a fun game in synthetic cubism, which is much more light-hearted than analytic cubism, to figure out what is being represented and how we can reassemble this multi-leveled and viewed painting. Right, so we're moving with Cubism from analyzing a singular object that is going to be stationary from multiple angles and recombining it on one surface to synthesizing various media to do the same. So Cubism is going to, in turn, influence a variety of movements. Its influence cannot be underestimated, or overestimated, I should say, in this instance. One of those movements is Futurism. So Futurism, like Cubism, will seemingly show objects that are fractured, but for an entirely different purpose. Futurism is going to be born in Italy and is the brainchild of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who writes the Futurist Manifesto in 1909. Wherein he champions the idea of a world war, traveling to college campuses around Europe and the UK, riling up college students, demanding that they are going to be active in destroying everything that is old. So he calls museums mausoleums of culture. We should destroy all old buildings and everything from the past to make way for the future. What is the future, according to futurists? Well, one dominated by speed, technology, progress. So many of their works are going to be related to war and war machines, such as the armored train in action seen here by Gino Severini. So the train, as you see, is actually one that existed at the time that would also be used in World War I, this upcoming battle that would pit all major European powers and then finally the United States against one another, whereby we see from the top these riflemen firing from this armored train that has gun turrets on the top of it. The fracturing and bright meant to emphasize the speed of this technology, because the futurists admired speed and technology, which led to cars, trains, airplanes. They glorify violence, the industrial city, and of course, the technological triumph of humanity over nature. So you find that they do not appreciate landscapes. They believe that motion is what most captures and defines the new modern world through technology. We are moving faster. We can kill people more easily from a greater distance. We can once again cross vast distances very rapidly. So they love race cars and aeroplanes. Now, this is nothing new. You find that nearly a generation earlier, Edward Muybridge was already doing a series of chronophotographs where he's trying to show what things look like in motion, right? So he eventually is going to come up with an alternative to the motion picture, which is going to be the zopraxiscope, where he shows these images quickly in succession, and it looks like they are moving. So here in The Horse Galloping, we have a bet whereby it was believed that a horse's legs did not come all the way off the ground when running. Muybridge argued that they did, so he sets up a series of stop-motion cameras around a track and thus demonstrates that that is the fact. Horses do, in fact, lift all of their legs off the ground. But this interest in chronophotography has much more marketable and significant applications than merely proving a bet. Instead, we have, with chronophotography, the overlapping means to suggest motion. So things in direct and uniform sequence suggest that they are moving dynamically. So we find that unlike Cubism, which very often Futurism can be mistaken for Cubism, we find that number one, the Futurists prefer bright, vivid colors that suggest motion, violence, and action. And secondly, we find that with Cubism, we, the spectator or artist, are walking around a stationary object and reassembling it. Whereas with Futurism, the object is moving in front of us and we are stationary. The viewer is stationary. right? So we find that motion, according to the futurists, is going to represent technology for them, and technology equals progress. We're moving forward and destroying everything old to make way for the future. Now, in sculpture, this can also be carried out, as demonstrated by Umberto Baccioni in his Unique Forms of Continuity in Space of 1913. So in sculpture, what we have here is not a man running necessarily. Here is the sculpture from an angle, because you'll notice there are no arms, and we have these additional protrusions of flame-like planes coming off of the body. So you find that instead, what we are looking at is instead the motion that a human figure makes while running. So we find that the moving of the arm forward, the lifting of the leg and coming back down, these are much more akin to trying to capture a wind tunnel, or showing what motion is going around a figure as it's blurring, moving so quickly in space. Right, so capturing the person is not the paramount goal here, but instead trying to represent motion itself. How do we capture and represent motion? So we find that what is interesting about the futurists is that they demand the destruction of everything old, and specifically they cite the Nike of Samothrace here in the Louvre. But the same principles of visual organization and dynamism are at play. We find that the figure is in the same position, right leg forward, left leg back, in the dramatically striding form, suggesting that they are in motion. So whereas the futurists wanted to abandon the past and everything from history, they are still drawing from that tradition to express their goals, to express their interests in technology and motion. Now, how does all of this get to America? Well, in 1913, the same year as Baccioni's sculpture, the Armory Show takes place in New York, named as such because it's installed in the 69th Regiment Armory in New York, a huge interior space where American artists and critics for the first time can see all of this avant-garde art, including Cubism and Fauvism and Futurism. One of those on exhibit is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase No. 2, which a critic described as an explosion in a shingle factory, and one can see why. Of course, very pragmatically and prosaically, the critic is going to state what it looks like without understanding what is intended by the artist. So here we have a monochromatic approach to Futurism that resembles, again, Cubism. But Marcel Duchamp is showing us a figure that is going to be moving down a staircase while we are stable, while we are stationary, witnessing it. To illustrate it, Life magazine actually reconstructed this, overlaying a woman walking down a staircase to showcase the significance of the notion of time in art and how it radically changes how we view the world, leading to motion pictures and animation and engagement with the temporal realm. So we find that the futurists are going to demand a world war. They will glorify motion and technology and violence and the technologies that end men's lives.